My name is Amalia Leifeste. I am the outgoing NCPE chair, and I am delighted to welcome Sue Ann Pemberton, who is the incoming NCPE chair and who will be moderating our session today. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers. Their names and a little bit about their presentation is on the screen in front of you, but I'd like to take a moment to welcome Anna Nau, Michael Tomlin, Helena Curry, Kate Carpenter-Bernier, and Mika Hales. We'll be sharing some presentations with you. This is a 3-hour gathering, and so if it is something that you can't attend all the way through, I'd like to also let you know that this is being recorded, and we will post it to NCPE's YouTube channel. So if you would like to review any of the material, use this in a class as a teaching opportunity, or come back and review the content yourself, it will be available there in the upcoming days. Without further ado, I will pass the microphone over to Sue Ann Pemberton, our moderator, and allow this webinar content to get rolling. Thanks again for joining us.
I'm sorry, we're having a little meltdown over here on my end. Yes, there are a couple of things that we'd like to talk about. I do welcome you to this conference. We have some very informative presentations. I have to say that I have learned a lot in the last few weeks from our presenters, and we do recognize that 3 hours is a long time. So what we thought we would do is have the first two presenters, and if you have compelling questions, you feel free to add any of the questions in the chat, but we might try to answer some as our presenters swap out. And then after the first two presenters, we will have a 10-minute official break so that everybody can refresh, whether it's coffee or cocktail, depending on your time zone, because we know that we have many people from many different time zones. So I would really like to just welcome everyone again, and thank you for joining us. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Anna Nau.
Thank you so much, Sue Ann. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. I'm going to be presenting on a bit about the early history of preservation and the role of the architecture profession in the United States. I am a senior associate at Ford Powell and Carson Architects in San Antonio, Texas, and this research is actually based off of my doctoral dissertation, which I completed last year at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm grateful to Sue Ann for inviting me to be part of this group today to present. And it's been really lovely getting to know my fellow co-presenters, Michael and Lena, the last couple of weeks while we've been organizing this. So again, thanks for joining us today. So I'll be focusing in the next 20 to 30 minutes on the early development of one concept of what it means to be a preservation professional by exploring how, and most importantly, why the American Institute of Architects, also known as the AIA, and some of its most prominent members and leaders first became involved in preservation and restoration campaigns and projects in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Ever since, maybe I'll get my mouse working here. Ever since Charles Hosmer's landmark 1965 book, The Presence of the Past, the history of preservation in the United States, he presented architects as being somewhat peripheral figures in the development of the preservation movement until the beginning of restoration in colonial Williamsburg beginning in 1926. And this in notable contrast to their European counterparts. While amateur, quote unquote amateur or advocate preservationists like the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, famously in the 1850s, and arguably led the early movement of preservation, a notable group of prominent architects began to play a more active role in defining, documenting, and treating historic buildings between the 1870s and the 1920s. So the rise of preservation as a field of inquiry and practice occurred alongside the modern professionalization of architecture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, both in the United States, North America, and in Europe. And it was in the second half of the 19th century that architecture began professionalizing, part of an emergence of an urban professional middle class. This included the establishment of the American Institute of Architects in 1857, the first university architecture programs in the 1860s and 1870s at MIT, at Cornell, Illinois, and new specialized journals like the American Architect and Building News, which was part of a proliferation of journals and magazines and new kind of print media in this period. As architectural historian Mary Woods has argued, architects in the US struggled to gain, quote, recognition as professional practitioners and artists throughout the late 19th century. So, the larger context of what I'm going to be talking about is this kind of struggle that architects had as a profession to be recognized kind of on par with doctors and lawyers and other professionals in this period. And unlike other early preservationists of the era, such as antiquarians, voluntary groups, advocates, architects were part of a distinct professional class, and thus their motivations for engaging with and even leading preservation efforts sometimes differed from those, quote, amateur preservationists. Another important context for this story, of course, is that roughly 50-year period surrounding the turn of the 20th century that witnessed a significant shift in the ways architects and the public more broadly understood America's architectural heritage, and particularly the popularization of the colonial revival movement. Both professional and wider popular interest in the colonial past increased in the last quarter of the 19th century. Examples at World's Fairs, of course, like the 1876 Centennial Celebration in Philadelphia, as well as the 1893 Chicago's World Fair, where you saw state buildings celebrating some of those colonial pasts. You see Massachusetts building here on the bottom being a replica of the recently demolished, not terribly recently, but recently demolished John Hancock House in Boston. And this really encouraged interest in historic buildings and nascent architectural history scholarship. So at the same time, kind of early architectural history scholarship was also being produced in the country. And a lot of that being published initially in journals like the American Architect and Building News. It was in 1890 that the AIA made its first public stance officially on preservation. At that year's annual convention, the New York architect Richard M. Upjohn called for the creation of, quote, a committee on the conservation of public architecture. And he said, quote, if there is anyone whose province it is to take charge of the preservation of architectural buildings, especially of the national buildings, it is the American Institute of Architects. He stressed the need to concentrate on, quote, historical and monumental public buildings, those that state and municipal authorities might propose to demolish, like the threatened Custom House and Treasury building on Wall Street you see here on the right. This was the impetus for his calling for this committee that year. While the committee fizzled out after a few years, Upjohn's belief that the AIA, which is of course the representative body of the profession that was consciously striving to assert its professional authority in the US at that time, that they should act as leaders in preservation of national buildings, was taken up by several leaders within the AIA in the following 2 decades. And this brings me to the case studies that I use for this research. 3 projects for significant civic buildings that illustrate the ways in which the AIA engaged in preservation. First, the Boston Society of Architects mid-1890s campaign to save the Bullfinch front of the Massachusetts State House in Boston. Second, the National AIA's campaign in the years around 1900 to prevent a significant expansion of the White House, and a subsequent restoration and addition by McKim White. And lastly, the Philadelphia AIA chapter's work to restore the Independence Hall complex of buildings between 1898 and the 1920s. So in the early 1890s, the Boston Society of Architects, which then became a local chapter for the AIA, organized a vocal protest against the proposal to demolish Charles Bulfinch's late 18th century Massachusetts State House. Other preservation historians have highlighted this was the fight to save the State House was the first time an organized group of architects played a lead role in advocating for preservation of a major public building in the US. But I wanted to know why, and specifically what their arguments were. In 1892, when a very large expansion to the building was nearing completion, and that's what you see here on the right, the state legislature's construction commissioners argued that the Bullfinch portion was outdated, structurally unsound, and a fire hazard, despite earlier assurances from them that it was to be, quote, substantially preserved. They now propose to replace the Bullfinch portion with a replica in, quote, fireproof permanent materials and in a larger scale to harmonize with the new addition designed by Boston architect Charles Brigham. The Boston Society of Architects, or the BSA, led by Charles A. Cummings at the time, made their case for preservation through articles in the popular and architectural press, a pamphlet, which you see here on the left, and at public hearings of the State Commission. And you see some of the meeting minutes from that in the center. During those hearings, above all, they underscored their expert judgment as professional architects, well-versed in the history of American architecture, saying that they were the most qualified experts to assess the building's condition and make repairs, recommendations for repair. At one of the hearings in 1896, Charles Cummings asserted that his assessment of the building, quote, may be regarded as testimony of the whole profession. So they were very much trying to present a united front as one profession. His colleague, C. Howard Walker, further emphasized their professional authority by invoking the respect afforded to doctors and lawyers as professionals. And you can see a quote from him there on the right. They rejected the idea of a replica proposed by the commissioners as, quote, counterfeit, arguing for the need to instead retain the appearance and material authenticity of the original as a unique example of early American architecture. And this approach really reveals an awareness that they had of contemporary restoration debates in Europe at the time, particularly the theories of William Morris and the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in England, which many of these Boston architects had very direct and strong ties to the arts and crafts movement at the time. So not surprising that they would lean on some of these arguments. And in fact, Charles Robert Ashby, who was a very important arts and crafts architect and member of the SPAB in England, wrote an article advocating for the preservation of the Bullfinch State House while he was on a trip to Boston in 1894. And at the hearing, several of the BSA members described more complex preservation projects in Europe to emphasize the relative simplicity of the needs for the Bullfinch front. Their main argument for preservation was based on what they believed to be the significant architectural and design qualities of the building as Charles Bullfinch's kind of premier design in the country, and the fact that the building was a subsequent model for other government buildings in the country, most especially the Capitol building in DC. Bullfinch himself was a source of pride for the Boston architects because they considered him to be the first professional architect in the country. And so by calling attention to this argument for preservation, they also turned the building into a symbol of national professional identity, drawing in support from the national AIA members and other chapters who wrote letters of support in various newspapers and journals. Thus, the fight to save the Bullfinch front became a statement on the profession's place in US history and cemented Bullfinch's legacy in the canon of American architecture. Ultimately, they were successful in swaying the commissioners, and the state appointed Cummings and two other architects, Arthur Everett and Robert Andrews, to oversee repairs and structural fireproofing and a comprehensive interior restoration in 1897. The American Architect and Building News lauded the appointments of these three architects, noting their standing as, quote, being representative of the profession in Boston. A few years later, the AIA's campaign to preserve the White House became the first architect-led effort to take place on a national stage. Beginning in 1900, the AIA, who had recently moved their headquarters from New York to Washington, D.C. the previous year, worked to defeat a proposal to significantly enlarge the White House by an Army engineer who was the White House superintendent of buildings and grounds at the time. And you see that here in this plaster model on the top right. Their objection, the architect's objection, was not to the principle of enlarging or adding on to the building, rather the fact that the proposed plan had been created without, quote, competent architectural criticism and advice, noting that the design reflected the work of a, quote, ignorant amateur. So really attacking the Army Corps engineer here for not being an architect. Glenn Brown, who was then secretary of the AIA and a pretty well-respected colonial revival architect in the city, organized the professional attack. He wrote articles on the subject, soliciting support from other arts-affiliated organizations, getting national press attention, and making it a key topic of their annual convention that was held in DC to coincide with the centennial celebration of the national Capitol. He argued that the White House was of such national architectural significance that the members of the AIA were the only experts qualified enough to design the needed alterations. So like the BSA's earlier campaign in Boston, the AIA's arguments in this case were also intimately tied to their sense of national professional identity. And the argument was really symptomatic of a larger rift between the architects and the Army Corps of Engineers at the time, who had long maintained oversight of new federal building construction in the Capitol. In the years leading up to this argument, Brown and the AIA were key leaders in trying to secure the right of private architects to participate in federal building commissions through regulated design competitions. So at this point, architects were not invited to design these new buildings going up in the Capitol. So Brown and a few other of the AIA members then formed a special committee on the White House that then lobbied Congress and to ensure that professional architects were involved in any work there. And they were ultimately successful in their efforts. And when Theodore Roosevelt ascended to the presidency unexpectedly in 1902, he turned to McKim Bean White, who he knew through various social circles in New York, to carry out a restoration and addition to the building. And of course, Charles McKim and his partners were at the time arguably the most famous or kind of well-known architects in the United States. So this was a really big deal for the AIA at the time. McKim had also been recently elected as president of the AIA, and he was serving as a member of the newly formed Senate Park Commission, which created the famous 1901 master plan for the mall in DC. He was also considered one of the best experts on colonial and federal architecture by his colleagues, and he advocated frequently for documentation of early American buildings. So even though he's not usually considered a preservation architect, in this instance, he can be considered one. Working closely with Glenn Brown as their project superintendent, McKim and his colleagues sought to preserve the building's exterior, restore the Georgian-style appearance of the interior, and accommodate the needs of the modern presidency. So he did make pretty substantial changes to the interior. We wouldn't necessarily consider this by our current standards as a successful restoration, but he replaced a lot of the Victorian decoration with new federal style finishes, but did retain the house's original exterior proportions by creating new east and west wings that were on a lower level and based off of what they found existing in the East Wing underneath the earlier 19th century greenhouses. And they created the separate executive office building nearby, which eventually was modified into the West Wing. While not adhering, as I said, to kind of our modern definitions of restoration, McKim and Brown really did sincerely understand their work as an authentic restoration, as seen in a lot of the project records and correspondence at the time. The AIA also saw this as a major success for the profession, and in fact, the following year, McKim received the gold medal from the Royal Institute of British Architects, and he attributed the White House project to one of the reasons that he received that award. In a speech in 1903, McKim underscored his belief that members of the architecture profession were best suited to understanding the architectural significance of the building and therefore directing preservation work. He said, quote, "Among no class of people was the feeling for the historic White House stronger than among the members of the profession of architecture." And he did show in many of the correspondence and records that I found a pretty keen awareness that the work would elevate the building's significance as an architectural symbol of the country and therefore strengthen the profession's standing in the Capitol. The White House was also part of this larger effort by the AIA to guide the future development of the city through their Senate Park Commission plan of 1901, as I previously mentioned. The White House restoration was in fact the first aspect of that plan to be implemented, and thus became a sort of litmus test for the argument for the necessity of professional architectural guidance in federal projects. Considered alongside McKim and Brown's leadership in the AIA's purchase of the historic Octagon property in DC as the organization's headquarters in the same years, the White House project placed architectural preservation as a critical component of advancing national professional identity. So the final example is the work of the Philadelphia chapter of the AIA at the Independence Hall group of buildings. So they first became involved in the preservation of the city-owned site in 1897 in the wake of criticism of a ongoing restoration of the upper floor of Independence Hall led by the Daughters of the American Revolution. City officials sought the architect's advice on other planned work. Over the next 25 years, the chapter led restorations of Independence Hall and the two federal era buildings which flank it, Congress Hall, which you see on the bottom right, and then Old City Hall on the left. These projects helped to bolster public recognition of the building, not only as an important symbol of American national and civic identity, but also as a notable architectural ensemble. Following their initial project at Independence Hall in 1897, the chapter established a committee on the preservation of historic monuments, through which they created a unique relationship with the city as preservation consultants for this site. Frank Miles Day, who led the committee for the Philadelphia AIA and the Congress Hall restoration between 1911 and 1913. And that work was based on the chapter's conditions assessment of the building that they did in 1900, which included measured drawings and a whole series of architectural photography, that they produced a detailed 44-page report on the condition of the building. And that was really one of the earliest I've ever come across of an early historic structures report, basically, and a conditions assessment, because it included a lot of historical information. They did some archival research and looked at old drawings. And this indicated a new kind of professional rigor and attention to methodology in terms of establishing the construction history of the building. During the restoration, the 5-member team from the chapter met frequently. They actively debated the physical and documentary evidence for various missing elements, including stairways and the internal gallery, and they provided their professional services free of charge to the city. The restoration was lauded as a success by the AIA and celebrated with a public dedication that was attended by President Wilson. Journals like Architectural Record called it, quote, a patriotic achievement that should encourage other cities to entrust similar works to the architecture profession. The AIA journal that year, Day wrote an article on the project, and he emphasized the fact that his involvement was the result of city officials recognizing, quote, the importance of entrusting such work to a body of properly qualified experts. The officers in the National AIA pointed to Philadelphia as an example, encouraging other chapters to create similar committees on preservation. One noted at the 1911 annual convention that other chapters should work with historic societies like the DAR because they, quote, fully appreciate the excellence of some of the old colonial work, but they do not have the ability nor the facilities for restoring or making a proper record of the building from an architectural standpoint. So again, emphasizing their unique abilities and skills as architects to engage in this kind of work. In the following years, Horace Wells Sellers, who had worked with Day on Congress Hall, spearheaded the restoration of Old City Hall and additional work at Independence Hall, and he took over the committee. He emerged as one of the AIA's leading experts on preservation in the 1910s and 20s, serving as chairman of the new National AIA Committee on Historic Monuments and Scenic Beauties between 1915 and 1923. And this was a revival of that earlier short-lived committee on conservation from 1890. The significance of the Philadelphia AIA's work at Independence Hall is that it was the most sustained effort to guide architectural preservation of public landmarks in the country up to that point. They saw their preservation leadership as, quote, a civic responsibility as a professional organization. Day and Sellers also emphasized the importance of prestigious restoration projects as a way of promoting professional standing and building relationships with city and government officials. By the early 1920s, their work set a standard for how architectural preservation could be an important component of professional practice for architects around the country. In 1923, the architect and historian Fisk Kimball took over chairmanship of the AIA's Committee on Preservation from Sellers, building on his work and clarifying the committee's goals to include, quote, education both of architects and of the public as to the proper methods of treatment of old buildings. And Kimball also became an important advisor for the restorations at Williamsburg, led by William Perry of Perry, Shaw, and Hepburn. He served on the Williamsburg Advisory Committee of Architects for several years, which itself likely owes a debt to the Philadelphia chapter's committee, and retained strong ties to the AIA's National Preservation Committee during those years. So in conclusion, I believe that these three examples show how architects began to push preservation practice towards an emerging notion of professionalism when it came to architectural preservation. In all three, architects argued that they were best placed to lead preservation efforts because they had the expertise and knowledge of older buildings and were therefore most capable of identifying and understanding their significance and leading their preservation. Preservation was one avenue of for architects to distinguish their knowledge of historic buildings from, quote, non-professionals, and was therefore part of wider efforts to shape American architects' professional identity. In doing this research, I found it interesting that discussions of what constitutes a preservation professional occurred among architects well before the traditional understanding of preservation's professionalization in the last half of the 20th century. When our field became more institutionalized and consolidated as distinct fields of professional practice populated by those trained in various disciplines, architecture, engineering, public history, you name it. We come from a lot of different disciplines. So today, of course, the definition of a preservation professional casts a wide net, including, like I said, those trained in history, architectural history, planning, public policy, archaeology, material science, engineering, in addition to architecture. So I hope this is an interesting bit of background that will lead into some more interesting discussions from Michael and the rest of the presenters today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. There was a question, and I'm not sure anybody can answer this one, is when was the position of Architect of the Capitol created, if anyone happens to know that answer? I know we have a lot of people from the National Park Service here as well, so I don't know who might answer that. Anna, do you have an answer?
I used to know that fact, and I cannot remember off the top of my head. But
okay, we'll get back to you.
Yeah.